This is Counterpoint.
On February 27th, the British Parliament approved the government's decision to proscribe Iran's terror proxy Hezbollah in its entirety under the UK Terrorism Act 2000. Home Secretary Sajid Javid said the distinction between the two factions was just smoke and mirrors.
I think that so-called distinction that some make can be applied to just about all terrorist organizations. As far as Hezbollah is concerned, I think we've seen a gathering of military and terrorist activity in the Middle East. The problem has become more acute. And thank goodness now the British government has made this very sensible decision at this time.
Hezbollah was founded directly by Tehran, by the embassy of Iran in Damascus, around three principles: jihad, Islam, and velayat faqih, which is the obedience to the supreme leader of Iran.
Welcome to another episode of Counterpoint, recorded in the European Parliament studio. On February 27th, the British Parliament approved the government's decision to proscribe Iran's terror proxy Hezbollah in its entirety under the UK Terrorism Act 2000. Previously, the UK used to distinguish between Hezbollah's so-called political and military wings, and in 2008, after the Lebanese organization targeted British soldiers in Iraq, designated only its so-called military arm. During the debate in the House of Commons, Home Secretary Sajid Javid said the distinction between the two factions was just smoke and mirrors. I've carefully considered the evidence and I'm satisfied that they are one and the same with the entire organization linked to terrorism, Javid told Parliament. The European Union, however, continues to apply this distinction, which even Hezbollah themselves reject. With me to discuss the implication of the British decision, also for the rest of Europe, are Geoffrey Van Orden, who sits in the European Parliament's Defence and Security Committee for the UK Conservatives, also a former Vice Chair of the Temporary Special Committee on Terrorism, and Tommaso Virgili, visiting fellow at the Martens Centre for European Studies, the think tank of the centre-right EPP. Let's start with Geoffrey. Well, we have all known for quite some while that the distinction between a so-called military and political wing are, as Javid said, nothing but smoke and mirrors. What prompted the government to now take, in our view, the right decision?
Well, Daniel, I think that so-called distinction that some make can be applied to just about all terrorist organizations. I look at Sinn Féin IRA in the United Kingdom. Sometimes it is convenient for governments to make a distinction so that they can find someone that they feel legitimately they can talk to. As far as Hezbollah is concerned, I think we've seen a gathering of military and terrorist activity in the Middle East. The problem has become more acute. We've seen Iran ramping up the threat levels in the Middle East, not least in Syria, sitting on Israel's borders, I have to say, and their proxy, of course, is Hezbollah. So it was a question of when are we going to do this? It's long overdue, and thank goodness now the British government has made this very sensible decision at this time.
Right. Now, the European Union continues to make this distinction. One of the arguments that they put forward is that if they were to ban Hezbollah in its entirety, supposedly it would complicate, if not make it impossible, for it to continue having relations with the Lebanese government, where Hezbollah is a member of.
Yeah.
How do you see this?
Well, the British government, for example, has not talked to the political wing of Hezbollah for a very long time, and that doesn't seem to in any way complicated our relationship with the Lebanon. So I think this is just convenient window dressing as far as the EU is concerned. The fact is there are divisions within the various member states of the European Union on their attitudes to what is happening in the Middle East, their attitudes to Israel, their attitudes to Iran. And of course, the European Union is very keen to protect the JCPOA, which it sees as a great triumph, misguidedly in my view, but nevertheless it's something which it attaches importance to because it uses this as an example of how successful EU diplomacy has been. Well, I think that's another fiction.
Right. JCPOA, that's the Iran nuclear deal, and you've mentioned Iran before.
Yeah.
Hezbollah is fully financed and founded by Iran, a proxy for the Iranian regime. So the increasing aggressiveness of Iran, both in the region but also here in Europe, where we've seen a few terror plots, so did that play a role in the decision as well?
I'm sure it has. I mean, Iran uses a number of proxies in the Middle East, but of course globally as well. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has now been prescribed by the United States, has been, of course, very active in Syria. Hezbollah, a Shia organization, has very much been funded, armed, and used by the Iranian state. Of course, on the other side there, you have Hamas, which, interestingly, is a Sunni organization, but nevertheless has that same relationship with Iran. So Iran uses proxies to carry out its activities, and Hezbollah is clearly one of these. And of course, what we've seen over the years, and becoming increasingly now, I think, tense and difficult, is this build-up of weapons in the Lebanon, stockpiling by Hezbollah, weapons provided by Iran, which can only have one target eventually, and that's going to be the state of Israel.
All right, thank you. Tommaso, you are a radicalization expert. From your vantage point, what do you make of the continued bifurcation that the EU applies on Hezbollah's structure?
Well, I believe that this was clearly a political ruse to garner consensus among member states after the Burgas attack to proscribe Hezbollah. It was the only way to obtain the consensus of the Council. Theoretically, it could be based on the fact that Hezbollah undertakes political and social and economical activities. But as MEP Van Orden was saying, is this unique to Hezbollah? After all, Hamas does so. ISIS also was running a government. Therefore, I think in practical terms, it doesn't make much sense. And also one should go back to the very origin of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was founded directly by Tehran, by the embassy of Iran in Damascus, around three principles: jihad, Islam, and velayat faqih, which is the obedience to the supreme leader of Iran. Therefore, there is a single chain of command that starts in Tehran, passes through the Secretary General, and goes to all the branches. As you were saying at the beginning, Hezbollah themselves have claimed several times that there is no division between the Shura Council dealing with policy and the Jihad Council dealing with military operations. Furthermore, one should highlight that there is a legal problem because the European legislation that created the system of sanctions forbids any kind of direct or indirect support to an organization blacklisted in those lists. So how can we ensure that what Hezbollah raises, the money that Hezbollah raises for its political wing, doesn't go to the military wing? There is a recent report that has been released by the Abba Eban Institute of the Martens Centre that does an investigation into the activities of Hezbollah in the West and shows that there is very little distinction between the military wing and the political wing when it comes to illicit activities, such as drug dealing and money laundering.
Right.
Therefore, I would argue that there are neither moral, nor political, nor legal basis for such bifurcation.
Right. If we can just turn back again to another argument that the Europeans make, or that the EU makes, that supposedly banning Hezbollah would somehow undermine the stability of the country. how do you look at this?
I think we can help ensure the stability of a country through other means. In other words, dealing with those elements within it that we regard as legitimate, providing the right sort of economic and social and cultural support for those groups that are genuinely committed to peace and democracy, and treating differently those parts which are quite clearly sponsors and activists in acts of terrorism. So I don't think that, as the British government has said, there is any need to compromise our relationships with the Lebanon.
Right. The British newspaper reported recently that in 2015 the UK security services discovered a huge amount of explosives or material that could be used for explosives in the UK by Hezbollah operative. What is in your, or when you discuss this issue with security experts and people who work in the security field around the EU, what is the sort of threat level that one attaches to the Hezbollah presence in Europe?
Well, apparently this threat is growing. There are recent reports from the German Domestic Intelligence Service that is especially warning about the rising threat of Hezbollah. The attack in the plot that was discovered in London is not the only one. In Cyprus, just before London, the same here, another similar attempt was foiled with the same huge amount of explosive that's been produced in what are called bomb factories. So this shows even the level of sophistication and the means that Hezbollah has at its disposal. We should not forget that in 2012, Hezbollah was responsible for a terrorist attack on European soil in Bulgaria. I would also reconnect the threat of Hezbollah to the overall threat represented by Iran and by Shia extremism. In Europe, we tend, and for good reasons, to focus very much on Sunni extremism, on the radicalization that has been exported by states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait. We should not forget that there is also a threat on the other side, and very recently, in my view, this threat is rising. If you see that in France, in Denmark, in Germany, different kinds of plots, either against Iranian opposition or against Arab leaders or against pro-Israeli targets, have been foiled recently. And this should be read also in conjunction with a non-terrorist threat, with the sort of soft power that Iran is exerting in Europe. I will make an example for the local reality of Belgium. The Islam Party, which has run the elections with very scarce success, but got to the news because it was proposing Sharia as the basis of legislation and the separation of men and women in public means of transportation. Well, this party is a Shia one. It has been allegedly supported by Iran. Therefore, we should consider the overall picture, I think.
What role is Hezbollah playing in spreading specifically anti-Semitism in Europe? And maybe if you can talk a little bit about the role that anti-Semitism plays often in general, also not just for Hezbollah, but similar Islamist groups.
Well, I would say that Islamism is inherent anti-Semitism is inherent to Islamism. If we go back to the founding father of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, was an admirer of Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and of his alliance with Hitler. Sayyid Qutb was one that raised the anti-Semitism to a different level with very violent language. But as you were saying, this is not something only of the past, because if you see the specific action of Hezbollah today, Hezbollah is specifically responsible for the Al-Quds Days. The Al-Quds Days are self-portrayed manifestations for Palestinians' rights, which is perfectly legitimate in a democratic society. Unfortunately, what we see is that there is a fine line between criticism of Israeli politics, annihilation of Israel, And on the third level, eradication of all Jews on earth. During this Al-Quds Day, we have heard chants across Europe, in Malmo, in London, in Milan, chants invoking death for Jews, invoking the return of the army of Muhammad to Khaybar, which is the oasis in the Hijaz where Muhammad exterminated Jews. And this is all part of the typical Islamist language. I mean, Hezbollah gave the name of Khaybar to one of their missiles. This should be reconnected, as I say, to the overall Islamist cliché. If one surfs the net or checks Arab TVs or Iranian TVs, there is plenty of these. I will mention just very relevant examples. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, an ideologue very famous or notorious according to the views that was speaking on Al Jazeera, for instance, and is considered, I still don't know why, a moderate by certain politicians and intellectuals, is someone that has publicly declared that in Israel there are no civilians, and therefore everybody is a fair target for an attack, and is someone that has publicly said that the next Holocaust should be at the end of Muslim believers. Another example, Tarek al-Suwaidan. Tarek al-Suwaidan is a member of the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood that has been banned by the Schengen area because of his viciously anti-Semitic encyclopedia of the Jews. And this goes back, as I say, to the founding father. Khomeini, in his little green book, was speaking of Jews as those that try to bring down Islam, that for Islam should destroy Jews before they succeed to do that. You see, what in my view the main problem about all of this is well represented by another inquiry of the German intelligence service, a recent one on anti-Semitism in Islamism, because there it emerges not only that anti-Semitism is inherent to Islamism, irrespective of Israel, is really a religious matter connected to Jews as such, but it also shows how this Islamist ideology has an influence on those Muslims that are not necessarily connected to Islamist movements. And here again, we need to stress the importance of tackling those ideologies that have a potential for radicalizing our communities in Europe.
Thank you. Geoffrey, this British government has really a stellar record on fighting anti-Semitism, not just in the opposing what's going on in the Labour Party, but general in society, and in many ways also what Hezbollah manifests, right? And the Al-Quds days that are taking place also in London. To what extent was that also in your analysis a motivating factor?
I think there has been, regrettably, a correlation between the growth of Muslim populations in Western Europe and anti-Semitism. We can't escape from that. If we look at the British situation, in the British Labour Party, they have a serious problem over anti-Semitism, which in spite of the very honourable stand a number of Labour members have taken, the leadership of the party has refused properly to root out this anti-Semitism. And I think part of the reason for that is that they seek to engage the support of the Muslim vote in the United Kingdom. And I saw a very clear example of that in our recent by-election in Peterborough, where there was a very deliberate playing to rather extreme sentiments in a particular part of the community. Most of our citizens of Muslim faith are good, loyal citizens, well integrated into our society. But unfortunately, there is a minority which is very vulnerable to these extremist influences. They rely very heavily on media coming from the Middle East, in their own languages, and that is giving them a particular slant on their attitudes to the Jewish population in our countries and more widely. So I think at heart that's where the problem is, and people don't really like to talk about this.
And Hezbollah obviously was trying to take advantage of the vulnerability of certain elements in the Muslim, and it is radicalized.
Hezbollah is one of the most active elements that is engaged in stimulating these sort of radical thoughts in a certain element of the population.
Wow. Gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and thank you all for tuning in, and come back to our next show for Counterpoint. Thank you very much.